A few months passed since Harry Potter realized what Professor Dumbledore was truly up to. As far as he knew, Dumbledore was controlling Patrick Harvey, Agnes Parker, and Harley Parkinton, and forcing them to play the role of his golden trio. Yet Agnes and Harley were 10 years old while Patrick had stunted physical and mental growth due to his years of living with the Dursleys and never going to school or having any friends. Disillusionment gnawed at Harry. The weight of Dumbledore's manipulation sat heavy on his chest. Gone was the blind trust he once held for the aged headmaster. The golden trio, charade felt grotesque. Agnes and Harley, barely out of childhood, were being forced to mimic bravery they barely understood. And Patrick, well, Patrick was a broken puzzle piece that Dumbledore tried to jam into Harry's role. He stammered through lessons, his magic erratic, fear flickering in his wide, owlish eyes. Harry felt a surge of protectiveness for these pawns in Dumbledore's grand scheme. He couldn't condone the man he once revered, but abandoning Agnes, Harley, and Patrick to the headmaster's machinations felt unthinkable. Fury simmered within him. He wouldn't be Dumbledore's puppet anymore. But how could he expose the truth without jeopardizing himself and the others? Night after restless night, Harry tossed and turned. He needed a plan, a way to navigate this twisted game Dumbledore had set up. Maybe there was a way to help Agnes, Harley, and Patrick find their own strengths, to become who they truly were, not pale imitations of Ron and Hermione. A seed of rebellion sprouted in Harry's mind. He wouldn't play Dumbledore's game. This time, he would rewrite the rules. But to do that, Harry would have to do something that he would have hated had he gone into Gryffindor. He was a Ravenclaw, and Ravenclaw students always waited patiently and saw all possible options before making their next decision. And Harry had made his next decision. He would have to talk to Professor Snape. The mere thought of approaching Snape made Harry's stomach churn. Years of scathing remarks and rumored blatant favoritism towards Slytherin left a bitter taste in his mouth. Yet, logic outweighed his aversion. Snape, with his sharp mind and knowledge of the darker side of magic, could be the key to unraveling Dumbledore's web. Swallowing his apprehension, Harry approached Snape's office one gloomy afternoon, using the excuse of needing help with a particularly tricky potion. The dungeon classroom, perpetually shrouded in shadows, felt suffocating as he pushed open the heavy oak door. Snape, his dark robes swirling, swiveled to face him, an eyebrow raised in suspicion. "Potter," he drawled, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "To what dubious pleasure do I owe this visit?" Taking a deep breath, Harry launched into his rehearsed story about the potion, keeping his voice steady. Snape's response was a scathing assessment of Harry's brewing skills, but Harry persisted. Finally, when Snape turned his back to retrieve an ingredient, Harry blurted out, "Professor, there's something else bothering me. It's about Dumbledore." Snape whirled around, his black eyes narrowed. The air crackled with tension. This was it. Harry had taken the first perilous step down this path. The success of his plan, the fate of Agnes, Harley, Patrick, and perhaps even Hogwarts itself, might hinge on the next few words. After a few hours, Snape said, "Thank you for bringing this to my attention, Mr. Potter. I'm glad that someone who has the last name of Potter has more than enough sense to ask for assistance instead of plunging headfirst into danger as your father had done." The barb about his father sent a familiar pang of anger through Harry, but he forced it down. He knew this fragile truce with Snape wouldn't survive constant defensiveness. "What do we do now, Professor?" he asked, his voice low. Snape steepled his fingers, his black eyes glinting with an unreadable light. "Now, Potter," he said, his voice soft, but laced with a hint of something that might have been grudging respect, "we plan." At the same time, Patrick found himself facing Ron and Hermione. Since he had discovered the ugly truth about Dumbledore controlling his destiny and forcing him to be friends with two people who he didn't really like, Patrick had developed an attitude that screamed, "Get away from me or die." That attitude had caused a ton of chaos in Gryffindor, and resulted in Patrick having to go to counseling with Professor McGonagall every other day. Ron said to Patrick one day after class, "Why would you say something like that about Dumbledore?" Patrick's defiance crackled in the air. He puffed out his chest, trying to appear imposing but falling short. "Don't pretend we're friends, Weasley," he shouted. "Dumbledore forced us together. I don't even like you or Granger." Ron's face flushed red. Patrick's accusation stung, especially because a part of him, a nagging insecurity, wondered if it might hold some truth. "That's not," he stammered, searching for words. "Dumbledore wouldn't do something like that. And anyway, we could be friends if you just gave us a chance." But Patrick wasn't receptive. The revelation of Dumbledore's manipulation had left him feeling isolated and distrustful. He lashed out, throwing hurtful words at Ron and Hermione like shields, pushing them away before they could get too close. This newfound hostility wasn't going unnoticed. Professor McGonagall, stern but fair, had taken Patrick aside for frequent counseling sessions. There, Patrick would rant about Dumbledore's control, his voice laced with a confusion and anger that tugged at McGonagall's heart. The wise professor suspected there was more to the story than Patrick was letting on. Patrick's anger didn't go unnoticed, as Stacy Snape and Julia Black pulled Patrick aside, saying to him, "Well, we've noticed that you've been having an attitude that most people here don't know about. What's going on with you?" Patrick didn't miss a beat. "Dumbledore's controlling my life, and he won't let me do anything. He's not a good person, and don't you dare try to convince me otherwise." Patrick's outburst sent shockwaves through Stacy and Julia. Dumbledore, the esteemed headmaster, a villain controlling a student's life. The idea was unthinkable. Dumbledore had always been a symbol of authority, a wise mentor who steered Hogwarts through its darkest times. To hear a student speak of him with such suspicion and defiance was unsettling. "Dumbledore is controlling your life," Stacy finally managed, his voice laced with caution. "Patrick, that's a serious accusation to make." Emboldened by his newfound rebellion, Patrick continued. His voice trembled slightly, betraying a flicker of uncertainty beneath his bravado. "It's true. He says I have to be friends with Ron and Hermione, but I don't even know them. And he keeps going on about some stupid prophecy." Julia, the more practical of the two, interjected. "Even if there's some truth to this story, Patrick, Dumbledore must have his reasons. Maybe it has something to do with Voldemort's return." Patrick scoffed. "Voldemort? I bet that it's all some made-up story to scare people into following Dumbledore." His dismissive tone made it clear that Patrick was deeply entrenched in his own narrative. Years of isolation under the Dursleys, coupled with Dumbledore's manipulations, had warped his perception of reality. Stacy and Julia exchanged a silent look, a question hanging heavy in the air. Should they believe these outlandish claims, or dismiss them as the ramblings of a troubled student? The truth, as always, was likely more complex. Professor McGonagall's arrival sent a jolt through the group. Her tall figure and no-nonsense demeanor commanded immediate attention. Her piercing gaze landed on Patrick, and a flicker of disappointment shadowed her usual stern expression. "What you have said about Professor Dumbledore is very serious, Patrick," she said, her voice leaving no room for argument. "And I have an obligation to investigate these claims." Patrick's bravado, meticulously constructed over the past few weeks, seemed to evaporate under the weight of McGonagall's presence. The anger that had fueled his outburst began to curdle with a cold dread. His accusations, fueled by a cocktail of confusion and resentment, suddenly felt reckless. Now, faced with the potential consequences of his words, a knot of apprehension tightened in his stomach. The tension crackled in the air. Ron and Hermione, blindsided by Stacy and Julia's hostility, instinctively tensed. Julia, fueled by a sudden protectiveness for Patrick, lashed out. "Out of all the Weasleys I've dealt with over the last few years, you are the worst, Ronald," she spat. "You think you can just bully Patrick around, because Dumbledore assigned him to you. He doesn't like you, and frankly, the feeling seems mutual." Her words hung heavy in the air, laced with a venom that surprised even herself. Ron's face flushed red, a mixture of anger and humiliation burning in his chest. He stammered, searching for a retort, but Hermione cut him off. "That's not true, Julia," she said, her voice firm, but laced with a hint of uncertainty. "We don't know what's going on with Patrick, but accusing Ron of bullying is way off base." The situation had spiraled into a confusing mess of accusations and mistrust. Patrick, now the unwilling center of attention, watched the exchange with a growing sense of despair. The outburst he'd intended to be a display of defiance had backfired spectacularly, fracturing the fragile peace and dragging his supposed friends into the fray. Julia's accusatory tone deepened the confusion. "Apparently, you and Hermione don't know the first thing about Patrick Harvey," she exclaimed. "There's more to him than you think, and Dumbledore isn't exactly being upfront with either of you either." Hermione, ever the defender of logic, frowned. "We're just trying to understand the situation, Julia. But making accusations without any proof isn't helpful." "Oh, don't be so naive, Hermione," Julia snapped as she faced Hermione. "After all, you put yourself and Patrick and Ron in danger on Halloween when you decided to face that troll instead of meeting at the evacuation point." The confrontation was escalating, drawing unwanted attention. Professor McGonagall's stern gaze swept over the group, silencing them instantly. "Enough," she boomed, her voice echoing through the hallway. "My office, now. All of you." Julia said, "Thank you for taking control over this situation. I'm sorry that I had to see it happen." McGonagall's sharp tone cut Julia off mid-sentence. "That's all right, Miss Black," she said, her voice firm but fair. "Right now, you and Stacy need to corral the first-year students and ensure they get to their next class on time. This situation requires my full attention." Her words were laced with an unspoken promise to deal with the situation at hand. Relief washed over Julia, momentarily eclipsing the anger that had fueled her outburst. With a curt nod, she and Stacy shepherded the bewildered first-years away, leaving McGonagall to face the complex web of accusations and mistrust that Patrick's outburst had revealed. Professor McGonagall, a pillar of authority and reason at Hogwarts, knew this wouldn't be an easy feat. Patrick's claims about Dumbledore's manipulation were serious, yet they seemed fantastical. Ron and Hermione, caught in the crossfire, were expressions of confusion and hurt. The situation demanded a delicate touch, a careful unraveling of the truth. As McGonagall ushered everyone into her office, a heavy silence descended upon the group. The camaraderie that had existed just moments ago had fractured, replaced by a tense uncertainty. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the window, highlighting the growing turmoil within the castle walls. Meanwhile, Harry told Philip, Eleanor, Duncan, and Candace about his talk with Professor Snape. "You took a huge risk trusting Snape, Harry," Candace said, her brow furrowed. "What if he tells Dumbledore?" Harry ran a hand through his hair, the weight of his decision settling on him. "I know it's a gamble," he admitted, "but I had to try something. Dumbledore's manipulating everyone, and Snape, well, Snape seems to have his own agenda. Maybe our interests can align for now." Duncan, the ever-optimistic one, chimed in. "Maybe Snape can provide some much-needed insight. After all, he's not exactly Dumbledore's biggest fan." Candace, known for her sharp wit, snorted. "That's putting it mildly. But even a broken clock is right twice a day, isn't that the saying?" A tense silence followed. The idea of working with Snape, a man who reveled in their discomfort, was unpalatable. Yet, the alternative, remaining pawns in Dumbledore's game, was equally unappealing. Harry, Philip, Eleanor, Duncan, and Candace realized that they were at a crossroads, the air thick with the weight of their decision. Swallowing down a surge of resentment towards Snape, Harry surveyed his companions. Philip's jaw was clenched, his knuckles white around the arms of his chair. Eleanor, usually so composed, fidgeted with a stray strand of hair, a flicker of fear in her usually steady gaze. Duncan, the youngest, seemed overwhelmed, his bravado momentarily replaced by a raw vulnerability. Candace, ever the pragmatist, pursed her lips, her eyes narrowed in shrewd calculation. The idea of collaborating with Snape, a man who had reveled in their every misfortune, their every misstep at Hogwarts, was a bitter pill to swallow. The memories of his taunts, his cruel jibes, were still fresh in their minds. Yet, the alternative, remaining mere pawns in the grand game orchestrated by Dumbledore, a game where the pieces were constantly sacrificed for the greater good, was equally unappealing. A tense silence stretched between them, broken only by the soft crackling of the fire in the hearth. Finally, Harry, emboldened by a surge of defiance that surprised even himself, straightened in his chair. "All right, we're going through with this alliance," he started, his voice tighter than he cared to admit. "I already know that Snape and my father hated each other, but I'm nothing like James Potter. And I'm going to make sure that he sees that for himself." That night, Harry sat up in bed, wondering about his own legacy. He knew both his parents went to Hogwarts from Hagrid's story, but James Potter and Lily Evans were both in Gryffindor. For some reason, Harry chose to go to Ravenclaw, the house where most of its members would study in the library. But was he really a Ravenclaw? Or should he have gone into Gryffindor like he was supposed to? He stood up and read the names of famous Ravenclaws on a tapestry that was over the fireplace, noting the name Petunia Evans. Was Petunia a Hogwarts student at one point in her life? If so, then why had she quit? What had caused her to abandon her magical education? Harry stood there for a long time, wondering what he was going to do next. He needed to plan his future, one that was going to be just a normal Hogwarts student. No drama, no far-fetched plans, and certainly no getting involved in other people's business. "From now on, I will be a Ravenclaw, and I will put my house first before anything else," Harry vowed. "I will focus on my studies. I will make my parents proud." A powerful resolve settled within Harry. Gone was the impulsive boy who should have gone into Gryffindor, ready to charge headfirst into danger. From this moment on, Harry decided he would be a true Ravenclaw. He would prioritize reason and knowledge, meticulously planning his next steps. Trust, once given freely, would be earned through careful observation. His thoughts drifted to his parents. He yearned to honor their memory, to prove himself worthy of their sacrifice. He envisioned their faces, filled with pride, not at reckless exploits, but at his intellectual triumphs. A new determination ignited within him. He would excel in his studies, unravel the mysteries surrounding Dumbledore, and forge his own path, a path paved with knowledge and reason. The adventure that awaited him wouldn't be a mindless rush towards danger, but a strategic game of chess, and Harry Potter, the cunning Ravenclaw, was ready to play.